Now, I have this next section listed as interface, and I thought about breaking it into two different sections because this just has to do with various types of interfaces. The first types that we have here, it's hard to classify these. The second section that we're going to get into is going to have to do with network interface. Okay, but they're all interfaces of some kind. Now, here I have an example of, I'm not really showing you the cards themselves. I'm showing you what's more typical, which would be that you have actual onboard chips. So you have your keyboard and mouse all the way on the left, and these are what's known as PS2 connectors. This is somewhat outdated. More often than not, we will connect our keyboards and mice via USB. And part of the reason why is because the PS2 keyboard and mouse, they weren't hot swappable, meaning you couldn't plug them in live. The other thing is that very often they were specific. The green one on top is specific to the mouse, and the purple one on the bottom is specific to the keyboard. Okay, so you kind of had to have those correct, whereas now you can just plug them into any USB port and you're fine. Up at the top, we have a parallel port, which is a very old data port that is almost never used anymore. Down near the bottom, we have the serial port. Remember how I mentioned how the serial port kind of resembles that VGA port in size and shape? But you'll notice the serial port's only 9 pins, and it's a male port that uses a female connector, as opposed to the video was a female port with a male connector. Over on the right, we have FireWire and USB, which are also forms of data interfaces, but much more common and more up-to-date interfaces than our parallel and our serial. Now again, this stuff is usually built right into the motherboard on board, and then you just have the ports out the back of your computer. But you do have the ability to buy expansion cards that you can put into your, your PCI slots, your PCIe slots, things like that, to add additional FireWire USB ports. Those would probably be the more typical ones. Now this is where I could break into the other half of, the kind of interfaces 2A, or 2B or whatever. I guess it would be 2 or B, right? The second part, and where we have, different forms of networking. Now the first one I have here is kind of out of date. You don't really see this anymore. This would be a modem. Traditional dial-up modem. Uses the regular phone line. Those are RJ11 connectors in the back. Uses regular telephone cable. And you max out pretty much at 56K as far as the throughput. Now I will also tell you that if you look at this card, you see how there's 2 of these RJ11 jacks, right? It doesn't typically mean that there's 2 modems. Okay, matter of fact, there is such a thing as a dual modem card. But the reality is that typically you're just going to have 1 modem chip on this card. And the reason we have 2 RJ11 jacks is because, well, if you kind of put yourself back into a day and age where landline phones were prominent, okay, and we didn't all have cell phones, and we only had a certain number of jacks that were wired, whether it was at home or at the office, it doesn't matter. And we didn't want to have somebody have to come out and rewire an additional jack at each desk, let's say. Okay, let's put ourselves in an office environment. At each desk, there's a phone jack, right? So that you can have a telephone. Now you want to have a modem from the computer. Well, you don't want to have a second jack installed. So what we have here in this card is kind of a pass-through type situation, where one of the jacks would be labeled line in, and this is where you would actually hook the modem up to the line in the wall. Okay, so the jack in the wall would then connect into this particular card in the line in jack. And then in the other jack, it would say phone. And by the way, very often it wouldn't even say the words. There'd be little icons showing you. So it'd be like a little picture of a telephone or a handset. But anyway, that jack is specifically so that you could still plug your telephone in somewhere and still use it to make phone calls. Okay, so it would connect the wiring and pass right through this particular modem card. All right, so that's what you would typically find on a lot of the modem cards that were out there. We have network interface card, or NIC, and this is an example of a wired NIC, where that's an RJ45 jack in the back for Ethernet cable, so that you can connect to networks, which is very common not just in the business environment, but also in the home environment, where you'll have your own little home network, plug into your own little home router, maybe connects to the cable or DSL internet. And if you look carefully at this card, and actually same with the card before it, and you'll find this on most of your network cards, whether it's wired or wireless, you'll see there's these two little dots, these two little round circles that are in the back, and those are actually lights. Okay, those are little LED lights. Typically, they will be green and amber. And amber is kind of a flavor of orange. Sometimes they'll even just make it truly just yellow. But what these lights typically represent, and there's a few different things, and sometimes you'll even see three of them. One light may represent just pure connectivity, just saying that the card is connected to a network. Another light is typically showing activity. Okay, so when there is data that is traveling to or from this particular computer that has this card in it, okay, so if there's data traveling in and out of this card, you'll see one of the lights flicker. Sometimes you'll even see the same light where you'll see one light that lights up solid just to say it's connected, and then that light will flicker as data is traveling. And there is actually the third one that you'll sometimes see, and that one is just sometimes just to show that there's power. Okay, just that the card is actually plugged into. I mean, in this case, it's a little unusual because it's an internal expansion card, and if it's in the slot, it's going to have power. But you know, that's still something that you may want to see. You may want to see that the card has power itself. So that's what those lights are for. I guess one other thing I could tell you that you know, as long as we're talking about the lights, is sometimes you'll see a series of these little lights based upon different speeds. Sometimes you'll have a card that is capable of transmitting at 10 megabits per second. Okay, so it works on 10 megabit Ethernet, or maybe 100 megabit Ethernet, and these days even gigabit Ethernet. And so you may see different lights for the different speeds, and then that light, again, sometimes you see it just lit solid, and that means that you are connected to that type of network. And then other times you'll see either a different light or even the same light flickering if there's data being transmitted at that speed. And that's what that network card is for. Or sometimes we'll even have wireless networking communication, okay, where you have a card. You'll notice there's just an antenna sticking out the back. So we can have wireless communication to the network. And then we even have cellular. And you'll notice that goes with the little mini PCI for our laptops. It's not very common you're going to put a cellular card into a desktop. Why use cellular if you're not moving anywhere? It's not completely unheard of, but not very common either. Okay, so these are all the various types of network interface adapters.